Scholars working at the intersection of hard science and theology often run into a methodological wall. They possess rigorous empirical data on the brain, and they possess rich theological texts, but merging them proves extremely difficult. The standard approach treats these two fields as distinct, isolated datasets, parallel columns, brain scans here, scripture over there, with no structural crossover. When researchers force a synthesis by stacking them, the structure becomes unstable. The biological and textual nodes bounce off each other, refusing to connect. This accumulation method fails because the brain does not build deep intuition by merely absorbing isolated bits of information in proximity. Stacking these facts only yields surface-level, compartmentalized recall. Treating theology as a mere add-on to scientific knowledge artificially restricts a researcher. It guarantees that any attempt at interdisciplinary coherence will break down. To move past compartmentalized recall, we need a different epistemological model, one where integration happens at the base level of how data is received. We call this an interpretive architecture. In an academic context, this means establishing a pre-existing structure that organizes, sorts, and anchors incoming information. The theological text acts as an active 3D structural wireframe lattice. When empirical neurobiology is introduced, the data nodes drop directly into this lattice, locking securely into the intersections. This 3D grid provides the necessary geometry to organize, filter, and understand empirical data. To understand why this lattice model works, we must look at the cognitive mechanics of learning itself and what deep integration requires of the brain. Consider the process of learning to play an instrument while simultaneously learning to read music. One is not only performing physical motions. In the initial, fragmented stages of this process, the brain is forced to manage two entirely separate streams of input at once. The first cognitive stream is the visual decoding of abstract symbols on a page, understanding the timing, pitch, and structure of the sheet music. The second stream is the raw execution of physical motion, training the motor skills to place fingers in exact positions. Over time, these distinct actions merge. The brain stops translating between two separate tasks and begins to process them as one. True mastery is achieved when these separate streams integrate into a single unified cognitive lens. The timing, the physical form, and symbolic meaning cohere. This exact cognitive integration applies to the academic study of neuropsychology. Memorizing brain structures, chemical pathways, and specific lobes is the equivalent of only learning the physical finger placements on the instrument. It is surface-level learning. This biological data requires a framework to define its purpose and context, the sheet music that gives the isolated facts their form. The Book of Genesis functions as this layer of meaning for the scientist. It supplies the composition through which the biological data is read. Achieving deep intuition in neuropsychology requires engaging the empirical facts of the brain and the ontological realities of human nature simultaneously. You cannot stop at isolated fact absorption. Returning to the 3D interpretive architecture we established earlier, we can now define its specific structural supports. These supports are the foundational categories derived directly from Genesis. The primary vertical axes define personhood and establish order. The horizontal cross-sections are formed by establishing meaning and recognizing fallenness. Depth axes map perception and pattern, completing the framework. Once these categories form the architecture, they actively govern incoming scientific data. Take a trauma response. Within this lattice, the biological surge of cortisol and the hyperarousal of the amygdala intersect with the categories of fallenness and relation. Instead of a purposeless firing of neurons, the architecture frames trauma as a disruption of a relational design. It identifies the biological event as a symptom of broken order, providing the specific ontological coordinates for the physical suffering. Genesis provides the structural coordinates where isolated facts about the brain find their relational context. This diagram represents the completed view of the integrated epistemological model. Compare this highly structured, readable matrix to the chaotic, disconnected parallel columns we started with. The data is exactly the same, but the organization is different. This study focuses on the development of an interpretive lens rather than the recall of scriptural content. This lens allows the scholar to perceive the deeper underpinnings of human nature, moving beyond the simple accumulation of data points. It creates a view of the connective tissue between the physical brain and the human condition. Without a governing interpretive architecture, neurobiology remains fragmented. It yields a lot of information, but very little comprehension. By allowing scripture to govern the reception of knowledge, the interdisciplinary scholar gains a coherent grasp of the human mind.